Thank you for coming out. I love Seattle. I was here literally 2 years ago, almost on the same day. It was like the first week of December when I talked about my last book, It Takes a Pillage. And it clearly didn't because it's still going on. And somewhere between then and writing this book, which is a novel, a lot of things that are currently happening in the economy, that are happening on Wall Street, that are happening with respect to Washington, continue to happen and also basically resonate what happened in the crash of 1929 and things that led to the Great Depression. And what I'm going to do is talk about the past and about the parallels to the present, before which I'm going to read a few scenes from the book, and just sort of each one I'll kind of give a sense for what's happening before and after, and sort of how that leads into then and now, and the characters and the fiction and the realities of life and nonfiction, and go from there. But again, I just wanted to thank you guys all for coming, and the Seattle Town Hall for having me here again, and Elliott Bay Books for being awesome and independent and staying that way. And it's great to be back. So I will start with telling you a little bit about the book and the first scene, because this came out sort of the end of September, around the time when the Occupy movements were becoming more nationally known, and there was a lot of focus on inequality and renewed focus on what happened with Wall Street with respect to Washington and everything else, predominantly Wall Street and bankers, and how come they're not in jail yet, and how come nothing they did that was a crime seems to be being prosecuted as such. Today I read that the Department of Justice decided that everything they were investigating with respect to some of these companies and some of the men that ran them, they decided was not in their pay grade, and they batted it back to the SEC, who's been doing nothing. So there's that. So things repeat, and there's when I wrote the book, the novel, and looking at everything that happened back in the 20s that led into the crash and the Depression, there was just so many parallels. But I wanted to take it into sort of more human element rather than all my analysis and statistics and composite information and everything else, which is background information in the book, but really, tell a story of just real people. And the character, the central heroine of the book, is a young immigrant girl who comes over from Russia, where there was a lot of violence and pogroms and whole towns getting slaughtered, which is all background to the book, and comes to the Lower East Side of New York, where she lives in a battered down tenement building with her aunt who's sick and her cousins and her little sister who came over with her, and winds up working at a Wall Street diner down on Wall Street, which in New York is very, very close to the Lower East Side geographically, but it's a million miles away today, and then more so in status and wealth and in power. And she doesn't know any of this. She's just a girl trying to live her life, have love, be a part of the American dream. And so she meets this banker who is a partner at the Morgan Bank, which means nothing to her except that he's dashing, and that's all she sees in the beginning. And from there, it gets deeper than that. And meanwhile, she goes home each night and she sees sort of the shoddiness and the struggle of her family and her boyfriend there and everything else, and starts to basically be conflicted over all of this. She's not a fighter. She doesn't start out to be a fighter. In fact, she starts out being afraid of fighting because of the violence that she experienced as a younger girl. But she comes to ultimately have to do something she struggles with. So in this scene, she's talking to her aunt who came over before her and witnessed the Triangle Shirtwaist Fire in 1912, where a lot of women were killed because the bosses basically locked all the doors, and when there was a fire in the building, there was no means of escaping, and a lot of them died. And her aunt witnessed this and was a part of it, but survived. So that's kind of the background for this quick scene. Lila eyed her aunt's hollow cheekbones and defiant limbs, the silver streaks in the wiry raven hair that she wore braided down her back. She felt her throat constrict. "Listen to me go on," said Rosa with a labored flick of her wrist. "Of course things will be fine. Enough with this Souris. How are things with you and Nelson?" "Oh, fine," answered Lila. "That's all, just fine?" I don't know, I wish he could be happier. He's always on about how miserable things are or fighting about something ever since his brother was shot. I'm afraid he may join the gangs again. I'm tired of it. I'm tired of not being the fighter he thinks I should be. Rosa nodded and swayed her body back and forth, her eyes closed as they transported her to the internal movie of her past. He's a good man with a loyal heart. You should try to see where he's coming from. Should. Rosa's words made Lila feel inadequate. She couldn't help but think of the stranger she had just met at the Morning Spot. That's the diner she's working at. Did he have any warmth, any goodness? She knew nothing about him, and yet he had somehow burrowed into her heart. I know, replied Lila, but that won't make him any easier to deal with. You remember what I told you when you first came here, a young girl of 14 not knowing a word of English, she asked. I do, Tanta. Lila braced herself for a speech she'd heard so many times before. It was her duty to listen diligently, but her heart impelled her to flee. She loved her aunt with all her being, but that love imposed such a burden that she wished she could shake. I told you that in order to succeed in America, you must find your purpose, and always help those less fortunate than you. I know, that's exactly what Nelson strives to do every day. It's just that you have such courage and patience. I wish I did. Instead, I just want to get out of here. Lila stopped herself, but Rosa seemed to understand exactly what she meant. Sometimes you don't find your cause, Lila, said her aunt with a little smile. Your cause finds you. There is a little fight buried in all of us. And that sort of becomes the conflict in the book for the main character is what is that cause, what is that fight, how do you interpret things that you don't understand? And one of the things we're seeing now, and the Occupy movement is a part of that, is this idea that what we don't understand doesn't mean we can ignore. Even though it may be difficult to change, even though we have people who run the country who don't necessarily seem to be doing anything about changing it, that doesn't mean that individuals have to lose their fight or do lose their fight for some. And for some, it means it's exhausting and why bother? And that's some of the conflict that this character ultimately struggles with. Meanwhile, the economy, the country is on this like weird sort of scene where the media, Ladies' Home Journal, everything from the fashion magazines to the new radio at the time to the New York Times to the Wall Street Journal are talking about getting into the stock market and how this is the way to be rich and this is the way to do it quickly. And people who are or have been conservative with their money, who came over, who save their pennies, who do all these things, who do it all right, are kind of mixed into this whole environment with people who believe this and who want to help it. And the fraud that ultimately is at the center of the crash of 1929 is really simple fraud. And that's kind of the thing even today. Fraud is really easy to commit. It seems impossible to prosecute given the situation that we exist in, but it's so easy. And the man that Lila falls in love with, this banker, he's also conflicted because he's a partner. He reports to the big sort of shadowy boss who is Jack Morgan, from J.P. Morgan's son, who runs the Morgan Bank, which is one of the most powerful banks in New York at the time, in the world at that time, and who has the ego and the gravitas and everything else to pull that off, and who doesn't say commands definitively in terms of this is the fraud you should commit. You should go and cheat on this. You should change this number here. You should change this number there. And then you should go and find investors and you should lie to them about what they're, none of it's that articulated. And similarly today, we have emails and everything else, but inside those halls, inside of Goldman Sachs, there isn't a sense of articulation. There isn't okay, these things, these securities, okay, here's how we get over on our customers. Here's how we get over on our investors. Let's have a meeting and talk about all the steps. It doesn't work that way. Everything is done by really quick looks and understanding and a few emails here and there, and that's how a little fraud becomes a big fraud that can take down a country economically. And it happened in the crash with very simple things called trusts, which were not too different from CDOs that are filled with toxic assets and subprime loans. At the time, they were bets on railroad companies or on oil companies, and these companies were the companies that banks like J.P. Morgan happened to finance and happened to be friends with and happened to hang out with. And so they raised money from investors to get in these things even when they were failing. And so Roderick Morgan, the main character here, he is a partner, and he starts to commit this fraud. He's in on it. He admits it to himself. He knows it, and it kills him. Well, it just gave away the entire plot. It kills him inside. So as we sort of progress to the morning of Black Tuesday, October 29th, 1929, he is dealing with a frenzy of trying to keep the game that he is perpetuating, the fraud that the bank and all of the banks are perpetuating, going as long as it can. And that's also a lot of what happened more recently in the subprime crisis, that the assets, the books, everything was perpetuated as long as it could be, as long as you could find someone else, some company, some pension fund, some little town in Norway or Holland or whatever, where you could just push the risk, push the fraud, push the trade, make your money, and get out and sort of dump it on everyone else. And it's very similar to what happened in the crash. But he's having issues with this. Roderick sat at his desk for hours drinking whiskey and ignoring the incessant ringing of his phone. The sharp clicking noise from the ticker machine across his office sounded like it was coming from directly inside his brain. It spit out inked figures with a frenzy that he was certain was mocking him. The mechanic arms inside its protective glass bubble tapped out lower and lower stock prices. Roderick strode over to the ticker. He picked the machine up, lifted it over his head, and smashed it into the solid oak wall. "Blasted machine," he shouted. Its glass fractured into a million pieces, but the arm at its center still fluttered. He raised his foot and stomped on it until it stopped. Lamont bolted into his office. "What the hell are you doing, man?" he demanded. Tom Lamont in real life was sort of the deputy of Jack Morgan. He was the guy that ran the bank. Jack Morgan kind of stayed in the shadows at that point, sort of letting things happen and sort of just directing, sort of the dark maestro. Roderick eyed him with thick disdain. "Get the hell out, Lamont." "Pull yourself together," said Lamont. "Jack wants us to take a trip over to the exchange. There's an important meeting going on at noon." "About what?" Roderick asked. "Closing the exchange or some such nonsense. Come on." The exchange was the last place Roderick wanted to be. It was just like his uncle to stay away from the fray, always in the shadows. He grabbed his overcoat and hat and followed Lamont. From across the lower lobby, Roderick saw a cluster of men before the bank's doors, yelling at the Morgan guards with fists clenching stock certificates. Lamont said, "Not that way. Come here, out the back." The two men exited the bank through the same steel doors that normally opened for truckloads of gold bars. Once outside, they had no choice but to barge through the crowds to reach the back door of the exchange across the narrow street. Fortunately, there were less people on this side of the exchange than raging directly in front of it, but the task was still far from simple. Just when they reached the back of the exchange, two guards told them to wait outside so that people wouldn't spot two Morgan partners entering. "They might just kill you," said an exchange guard. Roderick adjusted his hat to cover his eyes and waited by Lamont. He was looking down at his shoes when a man wearing a gray overcoat and matching bowler marched up to him and punched him in the stomach. Roderick doubled over. "May you rot in hell," said the man. Now that meeting in the back halls of the New York Stock Exchange, when I was reading through newspapers to do research for this book and just sort of the comparative historical facts, there was a meeting that happened, and it was told later, not at the time, that the whole idea was for these men to really come from the Morgan building, which was really directly like a narrow street that was between the back of the exchange and the back of the Morgan building, where there weren't as many people sort of crowding. You know, you see those scenes from the 1929 crashes, and I actually have one on my website that just has all that background and all the chaos, and they're just trying to avoid all these like people. And that was the idea. And years later, well, years after this, but I was doing a film for a Norwegian film company. That's why I mentioned a Norwegian town before. There was this Norwegian town that bought $200 million of toxic assets from Citigroup a few years ago. And it was the same sales guy in Citigroup in the UK. And basically, as the last stop of his life as a very profitable banker, he basically decided to sell all these bonds to these small towns in Norway. And in order to pay for these assets, the Norwegian local townships, who didn't have enough money to buy them, but were told they were like a great deal, this would be great for our town and everything else, they decided to use the future receipts from their hydroelectric power plants as collateral to borrow money from their local bank to buy from Citigroup these toxic assets. 8 towns did this. Like the same sales, I didn't even know I know it was the same sales guy. They're telling me the story, I'm doing this film, they're explaining the background. I'm like, it was the same guy, right? And I'm like, yeah, how'd you? I'm like, of course it was the same guy. Because that's what, you find a spot and you sort of, work it. And that's what he did. And it turned out all these assets had no value. This was into the subprime crisis. And they wound up basically losing all this money. They've been in a 3.5-year lawsuit with Citigroup, and they're getting nowhere. But they still have to pay back the loan to the local bank. And meanwhile, the townspeople are basically paying more for power so that the power receipts can go to the loan to pay back nothing of any value. And that's how one tiny little asset can be proliferated throughout the whole world and just crush a town for like a decade. So that's kind of what was the situation back then, except instead they were trusts and they were crushing individuals. And there was more direct kind of ability for a person to go down to their broker on Wall Street or in their local neighborhood and say, I want to buy this stock, I want to be involved in this trust. The bankers are doing it, I want to be with them. They know what they're doing, and I want to do the same thing. The problem is bankers always do things first. They have more information. They had more information into the crash in 1929, and they had more information into the crash of subprime in 2008 and into what's going on in Europe right now. And so that was kind of the same situation back then. And the leaders tend to not be involved in the day-to-day stuff. Jack Morgan wasn't walking over to the exchange. He was nowhere near there. He just kind of sent his boys, and the boys did what they were told. Now this last scene I'm going to read to you happens after the crash. And I have not read it yet because it happens to occur on December 5th, 1929, so it actually is sort of like today. And I had written this again before Occupy and before a lot of what's happening now. And at this point, this market has crashed, people are losing money, people are dying, and failing and struggling, and there's a lot of anger against the banks for some people, and then there's a lot of enabling from others. So this happens down by the Fulton Fish Market, which in New York is by the water, and where where the docks were, and where Lila's cousins work on a daily basis. And it's right after they've been busted. Lila and her friend, Rivka, reached the Fulton Fish Market docks minutes later. One of the fishermen paused from spraying down his boat to tell them the rioters had been taken to the Tombs. The Tombs? Asked Lila. Yeah, the joint down on White Street. They'll be in central booking for a while, said the man. His face was weathered. He stunk of fish. Wasn't their fault either. What wasn't? Asked Rivka. What happened? There was this rumor going around yesterday, he explained, switching off his water hose. They were going to be cutting jobs and wages to make up for some debts the bosses owed. The boys down here, they didn't take it that well. Was there a fight? Asked Lila. This Irish guy, he's not a fisherman, not sure where he came from, but he was doing all the talking. He said if the president could meet with hundreds of businessmen in Washington to talk about helping them and get a standing ovation for it, then the boys who work their tails off down here deserve better. That Irishman, he was a sight, he was. The man smiled. His name's Nelson O'Leary, said Lila. She blushed. You know him? Asked the man. They're getting married, offered Rivka. Really? Congratulations. Got yourself a real man there, said the fisherman. We're not, never mind. So what did he do? As soon as he got here, 3, maybe 4 in the morning, he marched up to the boss's office, banging on the door. All the other guys followed him. He was shouting, demanding the workers' voices be heard. Lila could imagine Nelson leading the other men. Part of her was angry with him for causing a fight, but deep inside she was proud of him for taking a stand. It was something she struggled to do. It was exactly the behavior that got her back up, too. Go on, prompted Rivka. Well, the boss, this German fellow, he's run the docks for decades. He called your Nelson a lousy Mick and slammed his door shut. Then they beat the door down, someone called the cops. A few minutes later, there was a sea of policemen here waving batons like the guys that just massacred a small city. He pointed to a dilapidated brick office building marked Fulton Cove Fisheries across the street from the water. Nelson and the boys were arrested for destruction of property and disturbing the peace. So there really wasn't a fight? Asked Lila. Just a lot of shouting? Yeah, but try telling them that. Those guys over there, he pointed towards Wall Street, they shout and it's a crisis that the president needs to remedy. Around here, it's a disturbance that the cops come to break up and no one cares. He saw the sad look in Lila's eyes. Don't worry, they didn't really do anything wrong. Worst case, they'll be in the pen a couple days and everything will be back to normal. He laughed softly and shook his head. Normal, whatever that is. So I was reading that tonight to figure out a selection, and there's been 5,000 people arrested in the Occupy movement.
Yes, and no bankers.
And no bankers. And then today, the Department of Justice, as I said before, just kind of like throws their hands up, and it's astonishing. I mean, it is really astonishing. It's not 100. It's not one city. It is over 5,000 people. And that was just the last count I saw. It might have even been more recently, but something like that. And that's so easy, and it isn't for a crime. Whereas the bankers or the CEOs that run these companies, because again, it's like with Jack Morgan, Lloyd Blankfeiner or Jamie Dimon who runs J.P. Morgan Chase. These guys know what's going on. They know exactly what is going on. They know exactly what trades are making money and what kinds of transactions are going to make money and where there's going to be a loss and who to give it to before they take it themselves. They know that. That's like what they do every day. So the fact that we, as a nation, the Department of Justice, just like punts, the SEC has so far levied a few fines against some of these larger banks, none of which came with any admission of guilt from these banks. All of that is just incredibly, it's demoralizing. I mean, it makes you crazy. In the book, and this wouldn't happen in real life. This is where you can do fiction. There actually is a scene, there is an altercation where there's a face-to-face between the people that were hurt by the major bankers in court and the bankers. And I won't tell you what happens, but the point of that is there wasn't ultimately a legal precedent to do that back then. I basically took the 1933 Pecora hearings where these big bankers got up in front of Congress and talked about what they'd done and answered mushed and everything else, and I sort of got mushed it into a people's court situation, which you can't do in real life. And back then, the main bankers also weren't prosecuted. They also weren't indicted. They also didn't pay fines. They also made it seem as if they just got caught up in the same market crash that just happened, that just sort of magically transpired, and that they had nothing to do with it. There was one of the bankers, Charles Mitchell, who has a cameo in the book, actually was running National City Bank, which has become part of what is now Citigroup, and he had some tax evasion issues, which got sorted out afterwards. So he did pay like $1 million fine or something for that. And Al Wiggins, who was a banker who was running the Chase Bank at the time, which is now part of J.P. Morgan Chase, he was shorting stock in Chase while on Black Thursday, the markets were going down before Black Tuesday, and these 6 bankers got into a room at the Morgan Bank in one of the sort of sleek conference areas and decided to put in money to save the markets and to show people that if they put in money, the bankers, then people should put in money. And this wound up sucking in a lot more people. And even after the crash in 1929, for a good 6, 7, 9 months after that, the market kind of came up a little bit. So the bankers were using basically people's money, like their depositors' money, because it wasn't segregated, to boost the market. And what happened was a lot of people got resucked in, and then when it fell 83% into the Great Depression, a lot of people lost a lot of money. And even the people that didn't invest, like now, even the people that weren't involved or didn't know or had nothing to do with it, like now, were affected by it, because the unemployment was everywhere, and small businesses closed, and they couldn't get loans. And the Federal Reserve back then, as now, was playing favorites with who in the banking community would get money to survive, and which banks wouldn't. And a lot of small banks, small community and local banks collapsed then, as they have now. So all these parallels continue to happen, but what did happen then was, and I spoke about this a couple of years ago and suggested it occur, and it hasn't. I mean, not to you guys, but to various people in Washington, also to whoever was here a couple of years ago. That Glass-Steagall was passed in 1933 as part of this commission, or as part of the Pecora hearings in Washington, to at least separate the banks so that they could not use their depositors' money to bet, so that if they bet wrong, they wouldn't be running through the depositors' money and losing it, and people would be wiped out. So there was at least a distinction between the elements of trading and speculation and lying and fraud, and just dealing with checking and deposits and loans to individuals or for homes or for small businesses or whatever. And that distinction was repealed in 1999, since which banks have become bigger, more powerful, since which they've been able to use, this time not the deposits, but people's loans, whether they were subprime loans or prime loans or credit card loans or auto loans or whatever they might be, to basically wrap up, to borrow against, and to resell into a global market. And this still exists. So even though this happened in 2008, it crashed the market, it crashed the housing market. It's wreaking havoc now in Europe. I mentioned the small town in Norway. This is something that is going on across Europe, yet we are looking at Europe through the media's eyes and seeing that, oh, these poor nations don't know how to manage their debt. We have to basically take pension money away from their people and cut jobs and provide all this austerity to them so they can get their act together and be good fiscal citizens in Europe. None of that is really what's going on. What's going on is a lot of their banks bet badly and have to make up for what they bet against, and it was because of and at the hands of the largest banks that continue to be the same big banks that existed in 1929, except now they are collected. They have government support, they have the Fed, they had bailouts, the Treasury Department issued $4 trillion worth of debt that they then talk about how we as a country owe too much and we need to cut, or think about cutting. The conversation goes in Washington, anything from Social Security to Medicare to whatever else to make up for the $4 trillion of debt that was created in order to float the banking system. So the difference is between now and then is that then there was a little bit of a beat back. And now we kind of have a coddling. And so, yeah, the book, going back to the novelistic aspect, the main character ultimately has this ability to at least face the criminal. And we don't have that now. We didn't really have that then. But what we do have, hopefully, are at least movements or people, or we have attorney generals that are starting to do the right thing. We have a couple of, well, no one in the SEC, but we have a couple of people running some pension funds that are starting to wonder what it is they're investing in. So it's all a very slow process, but it tends to be coming now from the state level more so, and from the people level. And because what is happening, or what has happened in Washington, is that banks caused what I believe is a depression. We're in a different kind of a depression right now, and it is global. And they have gotten so far away with this. And back then we had an act that at least beat them back. Now we don't. And so there's things that can be done. It's just really egregious that they're not happening yet. So part of the book is to take someone through the eyes of this woman who did not start out to be someone who knew anything about finance or fraud or banking or Morgan or anything like that, but just what happens when you're in a life situation where you can't shut up and you have to do something for whatever your reasons might be. And that was kind of the spirit in which this was written. And there are moments along the way where she does really stupid things and you want to smack her. But the idea is that it is a struggle to become aware of information, to become aware of what's going on around you, and to decide what to do about it. Because not doing anything completely changes nothing. So it's really a question of what can be done. Anyway, so I will turn it over to questions now, and about the past, about the future, about what is going on now, and thank you for listening to the passages, and I hope you enjoy the reading and the book, and let's talk.
Yeah, you just said that some pension funds are starting to ask questions. I have a significant holding in Tycref, the college professors' retirement system, which I think is one of the biggest pension companies in the country. I've always thought they didn't ask enough questions, And why haven't the big ones asked more?
Kind of for the same reason the SEC doesn't seem to be able to ask questions of the bankers. A lot of the big ones, well, all the big ones, have these relationships with all the big banks where they're sort of like their partners. And so a lot of the assets or trades or the recommendations that come through, Morgan Stanley or JP Morgan or Bank of America or whatever tend to have these relationships with, the heads of these pension funds. I mean, when I was at Goldman, routinely, the investment officers or the CEOs of pension funds were in the office. They were having lunch. They were hanging out. They were being talked to by a series of people from various departments representing various kinds of trades to decide, who was going to get them. And so that's one of the reasons. And I also think a lot of it is that, I'm gonna say they don't have the same amount of people. And they haven't been asking the right questions. I feel like with pension funds, I question why you would give billions of dollars to a JP Morgan Chase to manage for you, or any sort of an institution, and not have someone at least internally or independent look at what you're doing.
I think Tycraft does have internal people,
but they don't have the independent. Yeah.
Either the current or the immediate past president of Tycraft was the head of Merrill Lynch.
Yeah. So you become this sort of enabler. But the problem is you're in charge of pension funds. I was looking at one of the people who's running for Congress in California was looking into the CalPERS fund, which is kind of the equivalent, one of the largest pension funds in California, and they're not even toxic, not even weird stuff, but just their stock investments in Bank of America, and you're like, why would you invest in a bank that's trading at $5? Doesn't that tell you something about the solvency of the bank? And then wrote it down from, it just as a sheer, you don't have to be that bright to get this, and it's astonishing, and it's like I say, there's a couple of people sort of outside of it, some AG, some Congress people who are starting to ask questions. I get questions about this, but yeah, there's just this entrenched relationship where they don't ask questions, and it's just been around for so long that they're like, okay, you think that's a good deal? Okay. And hopefully that's changing. I'm seeing more questioning. So.
In the last 2 or 3 weeks, Lawrence Lessig was here and discussing his book, Republic Lost. I don't know if you're familiar with that or not, but it's a startling eye-opener. And that book, along with Griftocracy and Greed and a number of other books along those lines, have been enlightening to me. And I just wondered I haven't read your books, but I'm going to, and I wonder which one of your books is kind of lays out the nuts and bolts of what's happened that's not fiction.
Yeah, It Takes a Pillage would be the one to do that. Okay. And unfortunately, everything in it could have just happened again or yesterday. It almost doesn't matter. It's still going on.
Okay, thank you.
Sure.
What is your opinion on the judge that voided the SEC settlement?
Yeah, Judge Rakoff. I should have mentioned judges one or two judges are also part of that sort of AG mix of trying to beat back what's going on that's not coming from directly from Washington. He said, Judge Rakoff said of a settlement that the SEC made with Citigroup, and again, we just went through the Norway thing, so just imagine that's happening everywhere, and by all these banks, that the $215 million settlement that the SEC had with Citigroup, whereby Citigroup would just pay this fine, and the investigation into the shady deals that they were doing would just go away, and they would not have to admit or deny any wrongdoing. So basically, it's not even I'm sorry. It's nothing and a fine. And he said, that's ridiculous. There's been all these fines. There was a $550 million fine for Goldman. There was an $153 million fine for JP Morgan Chase. There was a smaller fine for Wells Fargo. That these things don't come with any accountability. They don't even come with the SEC having investigated what they charged them on. These are settlements for a charge. And that was his point, that there's not even this looking into the charge and determining whether the charge that the SEC levied on these institutions holds up. It's just like, okay, whatever, we'll just settle. And he said, no, go back, work on it, and figure out and investigate what the charges were. So I don't know what's going to happen with that, and if it's going to come back out or not. He'd originally, the same judge, there had been a settlement for $33 million with Bank of America a couple years ago, whereby Bank of America said that they had nothing to do with when they took over Merrill Lynch in the wake of the 2008 part of the crisis. Merrill Lynch was going to pay all these bonuses to their people, and a lot, and while the deal was being worked out between Merrill Lynch and Bank of America that was ushered in by the Fed and the Treasury Department, they basically were hemorrhaging value. That every day they were worth less because the company had all these derivatives positions, which, by the way, now Bank of America's customers own, but that's a separate thing. And there was a $33 million settlement, and he originally said, no, that's not enough. He didn't have as strong a stand as he had this time with Citigroup, and they came back with an $150 million settlement, which he approved. And he had said at the time that he was kind of felt, I don't know his exact words, but he kind of felt icky about approving it. So I think this was a way to come back and sort of get some retribution for having done that, and also make put forth the message that this is not cool. Because many other judges signed off on these settlements. So he really did what he was supposed to do, which is he's seeking justice, which is his job. So, yeah, he's cool.
First of all, I'd like to say thank you so much for being here. You are in a very unique position, and to be honest with you, I'm a little embarrassed because I think this entire room should be full. I think there should be so many people here listening to you. From my perspective, I'm not aware of your earlier works, but I think my radar was up because I just watched 60 Minutes. Did anybody watch 60 Minutes? Okay, so we had two other whistleblowers there from two of the major banks. One had come through Countrywide, then to Bank of America. The other was from Citibank. I'm a real estate agent, and I've worked with the other half of Bank of America. You know, Bank of America is this big company, and the various departments don't talk to each other. So you can have a couple who are working to get a refinance through one department of Bank of America, while the other department of Bank of America is foreclosing on them and putting their house up for auction. And they don't speak to one another. And it's incredibly distressing and frustrating to do. I'm wondering from your perspective, we saw these whistleblowers at 60 Minutes, and I think from what you've talked about, you've written other books that were more on the whistleblower side of things. And now you've switched to something that's sort of made up, but not really. And what caused you to go to that different venue or genre to do something? I mean, obviously, I can see from even the way you speak, you're very passionate about this. And I think more people should be listening to you. So my question would be, number one, what caused you to take this other sort of avenue towards getting your message out? And then the other part of it would be, what do you see? You mentioned the Occupy group. What could we be doing that we're not doing, that we should be doing, to get more of a solution to this? I closed my accounts at Bank of America about a year ago. I said, and it was really hard because I had accounts for my
They're
aging
entwined
mother.
with everything,
I
right.
was sending money to my daughter in college, and they make it really easy. You can just switch the money back and forth. And I said to everybody, I don't care how easy it is. We're not going there. We're done.
Good for you.
And so that's one little step. But if there's more steps any of us could take, I'd love to hear what you have to say.
Okay. Well, thank you. Great information and question. And I think, and thanking you all for being here, having written a novel this time has kind of weirded people out, which is fine. I think that what I had wanted to do, aside from exercising another part of my brain, and having talked about this stuff for a long time, and I still do. I mean, I still write nonfiction articles and talk about this all the time, was to find a different way of telling a story. And I thought that if I rewrote the crash of 1929, it's been done. And when I was looking at the same information, the same historical information, of which the crash in 1929 was a Galbraith's book was a book I used among many other things, I just wanted to find a different way to sort of humanize the story and kind of have an emotional aspect to it, and sort of connect the historical things that are happening in the background with what's happening in life, or in someone's life. I was doing an interview today, and it's not, it wasn't on today, like I think it's going to be in a couple of days or something for KUOW, and the interviewer asked me this question, kind of a similar question. And I basically, that was really it, that, you know, the idea of humanizing something is like, well, what will the story be? What will you write in 40 years from now about, like, what's going on now, in that vein? And that made me realize that writing about 1929 with the historical connections between then and now economically and in nonfiction historical life, that it was a simpler way to explain what was going on through a slightly simpler time, and a much smaller geographical distance between the Lower East Side and Wall Street. And now, if I were to write this book about now, in 40 years from now, as a novel, it would be all over the globe. It would be the family in India and in China and in Norway, and you know what I mean? So that's the difference. But it was a way to really aggregate the background with the emotional aspects of it. So that was kind of why I did that. In terms of Bank of America, yeah, they're evil. I mean, it's good for you to close that. I've had a lot of questions recently, like emails from people asking about just generally, like their retirement is a question in savings accounts and cash. And what I've said, and this is partially what you've done, but for example, there's no reason to have money in a savings account with any of these banks. Like, even if you're all tied up and you untied your billing and everything else, you know, sometimes if you have a mortgage, there's no way you're getting out of it, you know, and refinancing anywhere, so that is an impossibility. And I know that many people, you know, have mortgages with these larger banks, and that's a big, you know, kind of tie-in. But even if that's the case, to really have nothing else there, but certainly not to have any money in a savings account in any bank. And that's, well, any major bank, because A, you don't get interest on them, because they're getting cheap money, and that has cheapened the interest they pay to you. And B, there are smaller banks that pay more. And C, they charge fees. So on a small amount of your savings account, you're losing money to put money in a savings account with the larger banks. So I looked at, there's a website called bankrate.com where you can basically look and see, I don't know if some of you know it, where you can put money where you don't have to have a minimum, and you won't get fee charges, and you'll get a little bit more interest than at a bank. So at least if you have that, that's one step of getting out of a bank, where you don't have to untangle yourself from your bills or your mortgages. And then, of course, what you did is another step beyond that.
I heard a lot of, you know, the crash, and I think we're overanalyzing the crime. I know a lawyer who says, if you want to find the rats, follow the cheese. And there's an old saying that's, to err is human, but to really screw things up, you need a computer. And a computer is like a pry bar that can take up things that are nailed down, or a giant screwdriver to take things that are screwed down, you know, to the walls. And it's like the retirement accounts and the account managers you mentioned, they were in tight with the bank managers. So if I was looking at all that retirement money, I'd think, how could I get them to give me that money? If I looked at all the equity in all the houses of the world, I'd say, how do I get the homeowners to give me that equity? And then, once I create a condition where, let's say I could get the banks to just loan on houses to drive the value higher than it actually is, and then add mortgages and stocks together so that I could get the FDIC to guarantee repayment on those stocks and houses that I've driven up. It's the way you do bank robbery, home equity robbery, pension robbery, and robbing the taxpayers' tax payments for the next 20 years. It's like, when you look at the government, they took $1 trillion, and by whose authority? What legal precedent did they take $1 trillion without even voting on it, basically, and give that money to the banks? It was because, just like when you look at the CEOs getting huge millions of dollars after the crash, they hold up a piece of paper saying, according to this law, this contract, I get this payment. Well, the banks went to the FDIC and said, you have to pay for our tranches, our CDO. That's where you collateralize debt obligations, where you can sell junk stocks by loading them up with mortgages and selling them to the world. And everybody went crazy. They took the equity out of the house.
Yeah.
The question is, do
Why?
you
How?
see that too,
Yeah.
or?
No, absolutely.
It's a
I mean, the
simple
biggest,
crime.
the biggest crime. That's what I'm saying. A lot of that. That's why it floors me that the Department of Justice can't figure this out. This is honestly not that complicated. Which means there's that other layer of enabling, which is a government on a government layer, on the federal justice layer that really is involved in the crime. Which is why they're not prosecuting the crime. They're enabling it. They're funding it. So yes, definitely see it like that.
Freddie Mac, a pseudo-government organization that back in high
Yeah.
school I took real estate, and I knew about them long before it ever hit the public radar.
Yeah, I mean, I think all of that is part of that bigger picture. These crimes are happening in broad daylight, and they're not being prosecuted.
And
Do you have a question?
Thank you.
Thank you.
I guess my question would be, let's look forward into the next 5 years. We've seen that there are countries today, Australia and Canada, that have survived our tsunami, no thanks to us. But they never went where we went.
Right, exactly.
So you're now head of the Department of Treasury and the FDIC and a few other places. What are the 3 or 4 things that you'd like to do that would add some rationality back to this irrational situation?
Well, yeah, as I was saying before, the reason some of those countries didn't get as badly involved is that both our banks and their banks weren't creating as much toxicity and borrowing against it and inflating the problem and then basically dumping it on the economies of those populations. But if I were, I would first of all break up the banks because there's just no need for them to be that big and that powerful and that much of a market player. And I don't want them to be speculating with my money or having the FDIC back my money in order to allow them to speculate. So and this would be global. You know, this wouldn't be like, for example, if I was Ben Bernanke as the head of the Fed, I would not like trot my message over to Europe and say, hey, you guys got to do what we just did because that worked out so well, which they think it did. And same thing with the Treasury Secretary, same thing with President Obama. He was basically saying, look, Europe, open your coffers and like work this situation out. Basically, do what we did. And what that has done, talk about 5 years, Europe will continue to be in this downward spiral because you can't get your economy back if you're indebting yourself to pay off the investors or the bankers that created the economic downturn to begin with. Like it just doesn't work. You basically have to stop that. You have to break up the banks. You have to not fund them. You have to certainly not fund the trades. You have to completely make the derivatives market transparent, which right now it's not. There are $707 trillion worth of derivatives that are not regulated, that are over the counter, that are just contracts between banks. And not out in that's many times a bunch of large GDPs. And that number is 25% greater than it was in the crisis of 2008. So I just get sort of hard ass about all of it and just cut it down. But I don't see that happening, which is why we're going to continue to be in this prolonged situation.
Thank you for being here. And I guess I want to tie a few things to some of the questions, but it leads to your story. One is, I remember Abe Lincoln saying something to Harriet Beecher Stowe about why she wrote Uncle Tom's Cabin, and why
I like you already. Thank you.
So I believe that's why you wrote the book you wrote at this period, and I love the way that you tied in the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire, because historically this is its anniversary, and then on top of that, there were a lot of powerful women at that time that saw the injustices and the underpaying of the same labor, same wages. And so my question ties in with knowing my history with women like Shirley Chisholm and other women of our times. You as a woman, how do you see the changes happening now in the corporate world? And I'm just going to leave it at that.
Well, I mean, certainly, thank you. Certainly the banks are run by men. Treasury Department's run by men. Fed run by men, white men. There's a, and I just heard, I don't know if this is verified or what the exact deal is here, so I might be like sending a rumor, but that Sheila Bard has been asked to basically not continue to run or to sort of go up for her next term as the head of the FDIC, because she's the one who keeps telling them that they're crazy. You know, these banks have risk and you guys are just making it worse, and they don't really want to deal with that, so there's these conversations in Washington about who she should be replaced by, and I would bet it would be a man. So I think, and I think it goes back to kind of your question a little bit about the relationship between pension funds and banks and so forth, and certainly my experiences on Wall Street, which is that one of the reasons that men tend to, well, run all this is they have, but also they're like each other. And particularly the men that are running these institutions, like they get each other. They don't really get women. There's just a difference, and it's not comfortable. You don't go to the same golf games, and you don't like share, hang out in the men's room together, and all of these things. And it really goes back to that sort of mentality. No, like there was a guy, and when I was at Goldman, who they had these things. This one day a year, Goldman would give back to the community. It was called Community Teamworks, and basically, like you take a day off of work and like go paint a retirement home or something, and that was sort of your, absolution or something. And there was, and one of the guys who's now risen, and he's one of the top 10 guys I think at the firm now. He like literally found out when Hank Paulson, who was the CEO of Goldman at the time when I was there, and then became the Treasury Secretary, which again shows you how it gets all exported into Washington. He literally found out when Hank Paulson was doing his community teamwork, so he could get on the same bus or whatever, so he could like tag along. This is inherently male thing or just how it works, but that was all fine. That was just what happened, and he got promoted, and he's been promoted since, and that's just one example, and there's a lot of that sort of access and sort of similar behavior that happens. But like I said, there are women who are out there doing good things. There's men. There's Judge Rakoff who's doing good things. So it's, I don't know. I don't see Wall Street being run by women anytime soon, though, or the Treasury Department, or the Fed. So, or actually a lot of economic books. But that's no. But it's part of that same. I mean, it's just it's part of that sort of same team. But hopefully that's changing. So, anyways, anybody have any?
Is there any point, did you have an epiphany at some point while you were working on Wall Street where you just went, I'm not going to do this anymore?
I did that for like 5 years before I quit, but so a lot of the time I was there, and then I think right after 9/11, I just kind of that was sort of the main. I'm over it, the planes had hit, there was smoke, people. It was a disaster, and obviously, and the traders on the oil desk were like trading, and it was just weird, and and I quit a couple months after that, so for good.
So thanks for reporting on the 7.7 trillion before Bloomberg did.
Thank you.
They just kind of laid out who the players were after the fact, after they sued the government. But you laid the groundwork for that, at least from what I ever remember reading. When I started reading your work on Takes a Pillage and putting out that Excel spreadsheet. I was curious, it sounds like you would like to kind of reestablish at least some variant form of Glass-Steagall that was repealed by I think it was Graham Leach maybe in 99?
Graham Leach by the Act, yeah.
And if they were able to do something like that, we hear a little bit more rumbling about nationalized banks, and I think even Senator Cantwell here is a supporter of that concept. I was interested to hear what you thought about doing something like that, and do you think it would work, and if so, why, and what the pros and cons might be?
Yeah, that's a good question. Really quick, you can't. It is dangerous to attempt to nationalize those banks without splitting them up. because we've really been spending and subsidizing enough to deal with them as they are. So to nationalize that situation would be a disaster. It would be a really expensive, it's already been expensive, but bad situation. So you would have to first break them up before you can talk about nationalizing. So in the state banks, on the other hand, there's people like Ellen Brown and others, writers who have been, who know much more about what's going on with some of those movements than I do. But the idea of a state bank, or the idea of even a good local bank, is something that people can really trust more. I mean, these banks are they are really just trading institutions. The fact that they also happen to have accounts is really not their business. You know, they don't talk about, and they don't write it, they don't speak to each other about, it doesn't get reported because it doesn't happen, about how they're going to like give all these great new services to their customers and grow their depositor base. It's there. You know, and they get extra money, and they get cheap money anyway besides that. They want to grow, you know, commodities trading in China. They want to grow derivatives trading with Germany. You know, that is what they do. Whereas a local bank or a state bank has to be more responsible and accountable to the local area, which is better for the local economy or the state economy. So I think in that respect, given how badly the federal government has been dealing with the large banks, it's a much safer, and for the entire economy, our economy or any country's economy, better.
Trillions were made by some people and companies. Do they have some grand plan on where they're going to spend all this money, or?
They have a lot of houses in the Hamptons. You know, there's such a. I don't mean to. That's a good. They are. It's almost, it gets to a point where it's not even about the money. It's about the ability to manipulate and sort of power and influence that comes, and the having the access.
Cement their power.
To cement their power and their influence, because it's just what they're geared to do. And so the money, you know, whether it's you know, the boat, the house, all of that stuff, that's just to show. You know, how much they have. It's like back in the days, you know, the sort of in the late 1800s and 1900s, you know, all the railroad money and the oil money, you know, go into these like big mansions and big manors, and they were sort of closed off from the rest of society, and they sort of hung out with each other. It's not very different here. It's a little flashier, but it's kind of the same thing. And we're more global, and someone mentioned before the whole idea of like computers and technology just makes it more easy to sort of be powerful and influential if you already have it.
Yeah. Thanks. So one more thing. So if you have some sense of what happened back in the Great Depression, and you have some sense of what's going on now, is there a way to profit from it?
It's a legitimate question. You know, I think right now, as an investment question, I tell people, and I've told people, to stay in cash.